critical research about sexism in the game industry, and it's taking a lot of crap for it. But it's good information at a time when we really need it to actually know what's happening. So she'll talk about that. It'll be awesome. We'll have questions at the end, and we can run over because this is the last speech of the day. So a good chance for discussion into this. So go ahead.
And then we can all hug and look at rainbows. And I hopefully won't be too sad. It's okay. So, hi everybody. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I guess I won't do any of that, so my intro slide's kind of useless. But there's my Twitter if you want to find that. So I guess a little more about me. I'm a social researcher is my primary go-to title for myself. I started doing research on the prevalence of sexism in the game industry and how it impacts game content in 2013, and I ended up taking that to GDC as a panel with Brandon Sheffield, who's also really cool, and you should check out the stuff he did because his article kind of inspired my research. And I've also subsequently done a talk on PAX about the toxicity in gamer culture and where it comes from, kind of referencing some of my own work and also other academic studies on this and what we can do to fix it. And I also, if you don't want to listen to me ramble for a half hour, you can read that Gama Sutra article, which is just the succinct version. I've also done, I'm currently kind of transitioning into game design, which is why I've kind of been looking at all of you guys with very ogled eyes all day. I'm currently doing narrative design on a game that's mostly based in Australia, and they're all lovely people. So before we get into everything, let's talk about how we define sexism. Now, if I passed a top hat around with some paper and told you all to write down what sexism was and then gave it back, I guarantee you about 50 different definitions of sexism would come back to me. And that's because the Webster definition of sexism is not what we use on a daily basis. And so when I went into this study, I constructed a more practical definition of sexism to abide by for the actual study. So I use discomfort or discrimination that occurs to a person due to their gender. Now, some people say this is too loose, but here's my reasoning for it. There's two different kinds of sexism that occur on a daily basis. There's overt sexism, which is blatant or obvious discrimination due to gender. So that's very noticeable by everybody and therefore easy to call out. So this is something that I'm sure everybody has, noticed at some point and had to deal with, either if you are noticing it or if you directly experience it. Whereas then there's covert sexism, which is more subtle, subconscious. It's more about feeling unwelcome and less about a feeling of or more like feeling less accepted. And this is a lot harder to talk about because it's not like you can just say, well, you're clearly being sexist, because it's a lot more about the subtext. So this is why discomfort and discrimination have to occur in the same definition. So now that we have that taken care of, let's talk about the different pieces of the puzzle here. So when we talk about this, I'm going to go through the game industry and what sexism occurs here. I'm going to talk about how this kind of relates to the game content that we have and we're creating. And I'm going to talk about how this is impacting player culture. And before I go back to why it's important to think of these things and how they relate to each other, I want to talk about a quote from one of my interview subjects. And so the study, I'm going to talk a lot about data, but keep in mind, it was a mixed method study. So there's interview subjects I had from men and women in the game industry, some of them transgender women. And so I want to emphasize that it's qualitative and quantitative. So this is subject 7. I really do not believe that 99% of the people who perpetuate sexist attitudes and norms, whether men or women or anything between, are aware of what they're doing or the effect of every small instance of some comment or action. I do believe it's more a matter of everyone being a tiny cog in a very huge machine. On the whole, it's not so much anyone is deliberately antagonistic to gender equality or trying to be antagonistic. It's more that they are apathetic toward resolving it. So the point of this is to get everyone thinking that a lot of the gender dialogue is about, it focuses very individualistically on this one person's story and how, well, that is not important because it's one person's experience. And so we talk about sexism in the game industry and how one person experiences this one thing, and so we should move on because that's not what's going on everywhere. Or how we talk about this one character or everything like that. And so we go back and look at these different things. These are all separate institutions that relate to each other, and they are all separate machines, and how they interact has to be interacted with at the same time. And so when we talk about sexism in game content and the industry and culture, these are not things that we can tear apart without tearing apart all of them at the same time. And we'll talk about that in more depth as we get going. So without further ado, that's the right one? Yeah, that's the right one. Okay, cool. So bystander effects. So in my study, I asked whether the discussion of gender issues in the game industry is critical to its growth. And the responses I got back from men, 36% of men either disagreed with this statement or answered neutrally. So the implications of this is that in an industry that's over 75% men, over a third of those men either have no opinion on the discussion of gender or have a negative opinion of the discussion of gender, so this is a problem. You know, if you can imagine when the majority of people in the industry, this is a greater population in the industry of people who disagree or have no opinion on the discussion of sexism than the population of women in the industry. To put this in perspective, there's only 22% women in the industry right now. So this creates a frozenness in the dialogue because of the bystander effect, where, you know, sexist behaviors can occur, but nobody is correcting it because they don't have a stance on the issue where they feel like they should do anything on it. So where does this come from is kind of the next question. So social norms theory from this study here basically states that we as human beings assess how other people around us are behaving, and just that naturally influences how we behave. Going into that deeper, essentially, is that I studied in male culture that behaviorally they promote amongst one another that there are these opinions assumed that group opinion, blah, blah, words. Hi, everybody. So sexism is something that, as some studies have shown in male culture, is behaviorally promoted amongst one another because those opinions become assumed as the group opinions before anyone's even stated that. And it doesn't have to be overt. It doesn't, like I said, we're talking about overt and covert forms of this. So it can be as simple as a rape joke. It can be as simple as a small behavior. It doesn't have to be something even consciously done. And most of this is subconscious. It has to be a behavior that's just aware. So another effect is that another study cited that college-age men overestimate the sexist attitudes of male peers. So when you combine this idea that men at an early, in a very impressionable part of their lives are overestimating sexist attitudes of their peers, with the idea that we are influenced by the behaviors of those around us, this can show how we carry that with us in the rest of our lives. So a simple way to stop bystander effects is with interventions. One study I really loved by Kilmartin et al. In 2008 was that essentially they got together people who they studied as having more sexist behaviors than others, and they staged interventions with them, and 3 weeks later they found a severe reduction from their peers' assessments of them in having sexist attitudes. So interventions, when done correctly, can actually have an effect, and it's really simple way to start actually creating change. And it's another thing to note from the same study was that men who are familiar with one another are no more accurate at predicting their peers' attitudes than men who are relative strangers, which was something that actually surprised me. And it's something to definitely keep in mind when we're looking around the room and looking around who we know in our lives when we go about fixing these issues. So let's start talking about the game industry. So this is the numbers I got for overt sexist practices. 60% of women in the game industry admit to experiencing sexism to some degree in this study. Oh, quick trigger warning. At some point at the end of the study, I'm just talking about some stuff that might be triggering. If you want to duck out, I'll give you sooner warning than that. Just before I forget, but back to this. So 60% of women admit to experiencing sexism to some degree in this study. And then about over 3/4 of women in the study and over half of men know another woman in the industry who has experienced sexism. 60.9% of women and 44.4% of men have a colleague that has acted in a way they have found offensive to gender, the statistic for men was also quite shocking for me as well. And this kind of starts to show how the gender dynamics that we have in play in the industry start to have a lasting effect on women as of such right now. And so this other quote from Subject 7 starts to show how the institution of it, and as it's laid out right now, has the current effect. So at some point you just become, well, not desensitized, but you grow numb to it because it's the same thing every week. You know, this is isolated. This isn't representative of systemic problems. You know, those two can get you feeling pretty numb. It's not just a numbness of, I feel nothing, it's also the numbness of, I can do nothing. I feel totally powerless. You know, a frequent interview question would be, so, you know, have you experienced sexism? And I would ask this, I would say like 10 minutes into the interview. And these are about an hour-long interview. And they're like, oh, not really, no. About 80% of the time, I would say. And then about 20 minutes later, be like, well, there was this one time, and it was usually an experience in which they had sexism. And when I asked them why they wouldn't report it or why they didn't think it was sexism, then they would just be like, oh, well, you know, you just deal with it, or, you know, I don't want to cause a storm, because but essentially what happens is it becomes a coping mechanism, because when you have to deal with this on a daily basis, and when this is the culture that is accepted, it's not a choice for you to be able to constantly report this, because that's going against the norm. Now, we currently have a really great dialogue going on, which is challenging that, but for many of these women who have been in the industry for years, they still have that internalized. And so in the case of Subject 7, you know, that feeling of total powerlessness comes from the idea that, you know, she can't speak out about what's happening to her, because if she does, then it's going to have very real repercussions. And many interview subjects wouldn't even talk to me without being ensured confidentiality, because they were afraid if someone knew they were even talking to me about sexism, that they could have repercussions on their job, which to me is more serious. So covert sexist practices lead to these statistics, which are that 27% of women believe that men and women's voices are respected equally during work at meetings, as opposed to 43% of men. So there's an overestimation on the part of men of what women believe, whereas women seem to have a different opinion there. 70% of women and 51.4% of men feel the game industry has a boys' club culture as of right now. And 70% of women and 54.2% of men think that men in the industry are not educated or informed enough on the issue of sexism. So what this does is it creates this acculturation that makes women not feel welcome. A common trope in like conventions, for example, is booth babes, which this one obviously avoided. The common suggestion the suggestion I passed around with my co-presenter at PAX, a friend of his came up with, was booth corgis as an alternative. Because there's no gender involved there, and who wouldn't want that, really? But what the striking statistic to me is the top one about men and women's voices being respected equally at work. And we'll talk more about that in a second on the implications slide. Because what all this and so this was another interview subject talking about how she was the only girl on a team once, and you know, the way that this feeling of disrespect comes about is how, you know, she was the only girl on team, and these other guys on the team hung out together as boys, and they told a lot of jokes to each other, and she just felt like she was left out. And she didn't feel like she was given a chance because she was a girl, but she has this wit, and you know, she likes inappropriate humor, and not inappropriate as in sexist, but just being fun and silly at work. You know, I felt pretty lonely and outcast. And it wasn't like they were trying to exclude her, this group of guys, it's just they didn't think to include her. And that's where covert sexism comes in. So the implications of all of this comes down to a number of different things. Is that when women don't feel comfortable speaking out about not feeling included in the industry, how can we expect them to speak out about, for example, the design of a game not being inclusive enough? You know, this is how we start to see the institutions connecting and coming together. And when we see, especially when voices aren't being equally respected, this comes back to a study I also found when I was doing background lit by Abel and Meltzer, where a male and female professor gave the exact same lecture on wage discrepancies, basically about sexism, to students. And the male professor received a higher rating overall, in addition to a higher rating on honest and valid depiction of gender segregation in the workforce, and a lower sexist rating than the female professor, regardless of the student's sex. So we ultimately assume that the male voice is more respected in the conversation, regardless, and this comes for both men and women. And so when we think about the conversation of gender and who is speaking, we even though women tend to have a little more experience with the subject, and unfortunately, we have more of a habit of giving more respect and credence to men in the conversation. And this has just been internalized because this is the system that it comes from. And so when we also look at another study on ageism and sexism in the workplace, a lot of women feel like they have to fight uphill because, you're either seen as liked but incompetent at your job, or successful but disliked, because there's this idea that if you are successful, then you have to be stronger and have a more assertive personality, but that fringes on the B word, bossy, right? And that's not what were you thinking? Right? And so this is something that that ultimately causes a lot of strain on women who are in the industry. And so this leads to game content. When women can't speak out about these issues, they ultimately then have issues speaking out on issues of game content. So we're going to move on to that. So 84.6% of, and these are all industry stats, right? And I'm currently working on a new study to get stats on game players. So just keep in mind when I'm talking about these statistics, these are what industry people believe and may not represent the belief of all game players, who we make games for, and that might have a different variable. So 84.6% of women surveyed and 76.6% of men do not believe the portrayal of women in games is fair, which, considering what we have to work with, might be fair. This is a quote from Subject 20. I was asking every single woman who I interviewed, and every person, period, sorry, that's a misquote. I asked every person what they felt about, the current portrayal of female game characters. And Subject 20 gave me one sentence. Everyone else gave me like 3 or 4 minutes. She gave me this one sentence. I would like for them to be more like Olympians and less like Playboy bunnies. And, well, I kind of left it the way it is because it's just a very lovely quote, and it's very simple the way it is. And the thing is, though, is that I talk to women about this quote, and because I find it very lovely because it's just, there's so much poignancy in it, but they're like, but I'm a woman who likes to play sexy characters. And in the dialogue about gender and games, because I personally think that there's a little too much sexualization in games that we have right now. But I hear this counterpoint, and I think I understand that. So my counter argument to that, I Googled, for the purpose of this talk, female video game characters. Here's what I have. Sexy, 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 sexy. Less sexualized Tomb Raider. Sexy, sexy, sexy. Okay, sexy Tomb Raider again. Less sexualized Yuna, but then the sexy one up there. So there's very little variance here. We only have sexualized characters just on the face value of Googling the characters, and all of these characters, with a couple exceptions, like Yuna, I'll give an exception for, and I have a deep connection to Rose from Legend of Dragoon. But for the most part, they feel very marketed towards male players, which is, for me, a little less concerning. And if women like playing a couple of these characters, that is fine. I don't want to disrespect their choice because that is what they like. But I do feel like we need more variety for other women so that I don't feel like, as a woman who wants to play something else, this is all I have. We just need a lot more available for women who want more out there. Now, if I Google male game characters, it's a very different image. The only shirtless one is Kratos, and you can't really argue that he's a sexualized character because he's more of a power trope. And the variety of what these characters are, you can clearly tell. We have Ezio and Altair from Assassin's Creed. We have Nathan Drake, who's a very different character with a very different, diverse background, at least when it comes to, yeah, they're all white guys, right? Except for Altair, right? But he has a very different storyline, a very different characterization. You have a character from Chrono Cross. They all have a variety of role. But when I look at these characters, I can't really tell what's different about them because they're all dressed the same. You know, so I feel like when it comes to games, when sexualization, when used correctly and in right ways, can be a powerful narrative tool and something that men and all kinds of women enjoy. But right now, because so many women in our games are sexualized with very few other kinds of characters as a counterpoint to provide for variety, it results in women feeling ostracized from the community. So in the case of studies on the next slide, they also have latent effects on players. Mastro and Morowitz in 2009 found that female self-efficacy, which is a fancy word for competence because academics, was negatively affected by gameplay with a sexualized female character. And Brennick et al. Found in 2007 that gender differences are found for how participants find stereotypes acceptable, and that males are more likely than females to find stereotypes acceptable. So, you know, we're not just creating these games in a vacuum, and ultimately, when the women who work in the industry don't feel comfortable enough to call this kind of content out, or when the men in our industry aren't informed enough to call this content out, we begin to see how this affects our gamers, which I'll get into a lot more later. But ultimately, this may not even be necessary. So this is, again, from industry people. So I don't know how applicable this is to people from the player side yet. I'm working on that. But only 1.9% of men surveyed need protagonists to be their gender in order to relate to them. 1.9. Right? So 87.4% of men feel comfortable playing a protagonist of a different gender. And 89.2% of women and 69.9% of men in the industry physically want more female protagonists in the games. Blip, blip. So, this is not something that we even need to be doing, but we still see it as almost an archaic, a reflex. As well, it's we have to do the prime demographic. And I would hear that sometimes, and I'd be like, so what is the prime demographic? Male gamers. Where is this prime demographic information coming from? And it always seemed to go back to this idea that we're still marketing to this niche market of white male gamers in this 18 to 35-year-old area, when we have 48% of gamers are now women, and more gamers are women over the age of 18 than men under the age of 18. So this may not even be necessary. And ultimately, when it comes to our games, we have to think about representation, because representation matters. It matters a ton. Because when you don't feel represented, gotta get this right. When you don't feel represented, you don't feel welcome. And when you don't feel welcome, you do not participate. And when you don't participate, you become an outsider. And when you become an outsider, artificially gendered genres are created. All right, this is how we have, girl games which are just covered in pink and fluff and not as fun as the boy games, but then the boy games just feel so not for me that, what's the point? And this is where problems start happening. And the reason why I have that picture up there is because this comes from a Tumblr post where someone had a story up of when Oprah Winfrey first saw Uhura on TV in Star Trek, and it was the first time she saw a black woman on TV that wasn't a maid. And representation affects our audience in such profound ways. For GDC 2014, a One Reason to Be speaker was Lauren Scott, who's this brilliant girl. She wasn't even graduated from college yet, and she had made a multi-million-dollar game. She was a black woman, and, well, she is a black woman, sorry, that's misspeak. That doesn't change. But she hadn't graduated from college yet, and she'd already been doing multi-million-dollar games. And she talked about how when she was a kid, her father programmed a text-based game starring her, and she said how powerful that was for her because it was the first time she saw a black woman in a game, and that's how she knew she was welcome. And then everyone started crying. I'm starting to cry a little bit because, crap, that is powerful. Representation does so much for our audiences. And when we think about how that power can do so much for our gaming communities, it goes beyond just the moral cause. It's so important to think about what it can do overall for, our medium. And yeah, words. That was inspiring. So, as for this is from a study. Yeah, so this is Nikki's study on, he compared gender relations and differences in MMOs and online games. He was asking people what essentially they liked in the game and what not. And essentially he found that there was an enormous overlap in what people actually liked in games, regardless of their gender. The smallest one was at like 66%. You know, for the most part, in MMOs, everyone plays for the exact same reason. So the idea that, you know, girls aren't playing MMOs, you know, I mean, they are, and they are playing for the exact same reasons that guys are. They're not even the competition. And when he asked them why, they saw potential deterrence. Almost every single one cited the proportions and clothing options of the female avatars as problematic. And one powerful quote that was there was, for many of these female characters, the problem of being in an MMO, they are constantly reminded of the intended male subject position they are trespassing upon. On top of this, the male-dominated player culture itself becomes a deterrent. In other words, they must either accept the male subject position silently or risk constant discrimination or harassment if they reveal that they are female. So, which brings me to my next subject, player culture. All right, I am going to drink some water. Oh, wait, nope. Actually, I'm not going to drink some water because that's, never mind. There we go. So, 77% of women and 62.6% of men believe that the way we portray women in video games has negative side effects on the game playing community. And 66.9% of women and 64% of men disagreed with the statement that female game players have equal voices to male game players. So our industry people seem to see a trend where the games we're making have some sort of effect on the players themselves. This is supported by some studies I found when I was doing some backlit. Kuznikov and Rose did this amazing study where they compared some pre-recorded voice on live chat and found that female voices receive 3 times as many negative comments as male voice, or no voice at all. No voice at all, mind you, when using pre-recorded clips of the exact same messages. Eric and Beck et al. 2012 found that video games depicting sexual objectification of women and violence against women reported statistically significant increased rape myth acceptance for male study participants, but not for female participants. So now I'm going to take a drink. Now you tell us to erratic. All right. And this is where the trigger warning is going to start. As many of you know, Gamergate is a movement of the past 2 months that has been actively campaigning on Twitter, various websites, and YouTube for journalism in gaming to be less corrupt. A major complaint they seem to have is that the media covers far too much diversity and sexism-oriented speakers and stories, and that these speakers have agendas which ultimately harm games. They are a small minority sect of the gamer culture, which may lead some of you to question why I'm addressing this. I'm doing a new study on the desire for diversity for game content within gamer culture and whether or not the game industry understands this desire properly. I had enough data last week, but I was slightly undersampled in AAA developers, and I wanted to get a little more data. Gamergate found my study. This is what some of them had to say about me and about it. It is easy to pass this group off as a small minority that has no power. It is easy to say that they are shouting from their computers and that they can do nothing. But I want to remind everyone, this is the same group responsible for Intel pulling their ads from Gamasutra. This is the same group that has given phone threats and either successfully or attempted financial hacks on multiple members of our industry. Whatever disagreements they have, I must be clear. They act and construct themselves with patterns and mannerisms of a hate group, not an honest political organization. Anyone who would be happier for their descendants to be dead and threatening them frequently with such is not someone who speaks with any level of reasonability. One cannot have a conversation when they are afraid of threats. And yet we must if we intend to make any progress here. I also must stress that Gamergate does not exist in a vacuum. I do not want to say this with any amount of blame towards any individual because, as I've said, the point of this talk is to think institutionally. But when women get pushed to the outside of an industry for so long, and when game content is repeatedly marketed to a prime demographic, and we repeatedly call male young white gamers the prime demographic and market games to them, and suddenly shift in the dialogue happens where women stand up demanding to be seen, heard, and hiring, and this group sees, and then this is seen as violent and visceral for this group to deal with. You know, because these institutions engage in this way, we have created Gamergate. And I know that's hard to hear, but it's true. And so we have to be the ones to put a stop to it. So this is why this matters. 85.4% of women and 73.4% of men believe active and gender inclusion will benefit the working environment of the game industry. 83.1% of women and 73.9% of men believe that the more diverse the workplace is, the better the games the studio will be. And 77.7% of women and 71.1% of men support actively attempting to hire more women in the industry. We want this. And we know that our gamers want this. So we have to be the ones to create this. We have to be the ones driving this. So when we move forward on this, it's important to talk about this as an issue. It's important to constantly have the dialogue of why these issues exist and to explain why these issues exist. We can't just talk about individuals. We have to constantly repeat that these are bigger than us. But we also have to talk about how we, as individuals, can change that. So, in concluding thoughts, and bring this back to indie, because I know this isn't IGCon, I'm talking a lot about bigger things. You know, the fact that we are on the ground and that we can do these bigger things is what's so empowering. You know, we can start in small groups and make something that goes everywhere. You know, we don't have $1 million budgets or $100 million budgets, whatever they have. I don't work in AAA. I don't see their paychecks. But, you know, what we have are dreams and, you know, small living wages, and we make shit happen. Sorry, kids. But, you know, and ultimately we have voices, and that's what we need. Thanks, guys. All right, if we're all feeling okay, let's hug and cry and have some questions. Cool.
Awesome. So I noticed that your study talks to a lot of people about like sexism and whatnot. I was reminded a while back on the Polygon interviewed a lot of female game developers and game players about sexism. Were you familiar with that?
It's not ringing any bells right now. I may not have read it, but I'll look it up. Cool. Anyone else? Yes.
So I definitely saw at the end, you know, with the culture of the gamers, that's a big problem. There's hate speech and whatnot. What happens in the industry? Do you have any data, any stories from people who did speak up at their company saying, you know, this was made me feel really uncomfortable from a male or women's perspective? And how did people in the workplace respond to them speaking up?
I mean, so I have qualitative data on that. It can be, I'm not necessarily saying it's easy. One story that I gravitate to is a male artist who was constantly being told to draw his female characters more sexually, and it was making him really uncomfortable. And he complained to HR about it, and then the boss started to, you know, kind of publicly shame him for it. And there was, but the thing is you really need a support structure in your workplace for it. And he didn't have a strong one. There excuse me, in that in his work structure, a lot of the other artists would kind of gang up on him on it, and there seemed to be kind of like a group think that was in place there. And so I think that if you can get people on your side, staging these kind of interventions goes well. And if, you know, I think that the most important thing to think about is that where we create safe spaces for sexism, it can exist. So when you have like so when office sexism takes place, it's because, you know, they think the office is a safe place for it. And so when you call out, so if there's, for example, a space in the office where they think, okay, there's no women in the room, all right, we men are going to tell a joke, and one of the guys says, hey, that's not cool, then that safe space has been taken away. Their views may not have changed, but now they have one less space to express that view, if that makes sense. It may not, so then that one person, when they're not in the room, okay, they'll just tell the joke, but you know, that other person may have thought about it, and you see how it kind of snowballs from there? Okay, yes.
It might be
yeah?
a little bit off topic, but I'm just wondering, I mean, I feel like a lot of things you're describing exist in many other industries. Are there any examples of industries that were at one time predominantly male and that were integrated and have dealt with this issue that we could use as a model or take examples from?
Probably. I haven't been researching them, so I would definitely look more of them up. I've been focusing so intently on doing my games research that I haven't been exploring other industries as in depth, but I would definitely be looking into that as well. And then did you have one?
So I was surprised by one of your stats at the end that said 71% of people in the industry are interested in actually hiring more women.
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems like if that were true, more women would be getting hired.
So,
which I don't necessarily see as a trend.
So Elizabeth Sampat has this amazing talk that's like myths. I forget, she did it at GC 14, I forget the title of it, but it was basically just like women aren't interested in working in games and other myths. So like, we want to hire women so badly, but no, like applicants are coming in, and it's like, well, are you sure you marketed it to women? And it's just, you know, so it's not necessarily that people like, they believe they want this to happen, but it's just, it goes back to whether or not men are educated or informed on how to do it correctly, whereas how to find the educated and you know, how to find the women with the proper qualifications and how to like actively seek them out. There is a desire for it, it appears, but it's just a matter of if that desire goes beyond convenience. I think that's how I would analyze that.
Usually online when I'm dealing with people or trying to explain why like rape jokes are funny, what I get a lot is this antagonizing like, well, you're censoring me thing, and I really don't know what to say to that.
Oh,
do you have any advice?
All right. Goodness. All right, where's the water?
Could you repeat the question?
Okay. So the question was, how do you deal with people who think that when you say, hey, rape jokes aren't funny, well, you're censoring me. So one, anyone who says the First Amendment is a defense for things that make you feel harassed, nowhere does the First Amendment do that, and you can find legal precedents for that. So just Google that and put that in their face, and that should end that. If that doesn't suffice, you can also talk about what I like to use. So in the talk, I reference a lot that when you're at the point of threats of any kind, it's no longer a conversation. And for a lot of people who suffer from PTSD or who have like gone through a sexual assault, you know, it's really not okay to, you know, and keep in mind that, you know, rape especially, 1 in 6 women I think it's 1 in 6 women, at least in the US, experience rape, like just flat out. And even if you go by the Department of Justice, and then people are like, well, they fake it. I'm like, okay, the Department of Justice says only 2% of those are falsified, so that's, no. Stop. So, you know, if that comes up, there's your defense. And the important thing to think about is just that, these are very real issues, and much like a soldier who hears like some word he heard on the battlefield and that triggers him going into a spell, hearing the word rape for a rape victim can very much trigger that spell. And you can't see, and men also experience rape, and so that's also a thing to think about, is that we gender that dialogue so much. And I have friends who are men who have experienced sexual assault, and they struggle a lot with that dialogue as well. And we can't tell by looking at someone if they've experienced sexual assault. And so using a rape joke is kind of like planting a landmine. That's kind of how I explain it. You're just putting that out there and hoping that nobody steps on it. and I just would rather not cause that discomfort. And if that doesn't go through to them, then just consider, just let it be. Don't cause yourself too much distress. Yes, you on the floor.
Just to respond to that, it probably wouldn't hurt to point out that censoring is different than judging.
Yeah, I like that a lot. You're cool.
Another comment on that. Two things I usually respond with. Free speech is not the same as speech without consequence. And if the best defense you can give for saying something hateful and mean is it's not illegal, reevaluate how worthwhile the things you have to say are.
Yes. To repeat into the mic, if your best defense is saying it's not illegal, bad. just to make sure. Okay. Cool. Any others? Yes.
When you mentioned intervention being effective, like, how can we use that with our friends and family who are sexist? But like, how do we approach that and make that effective for that?
I mean, it really depends on the person, because if I have a friend who because I have a friend who's like really trolly, and I love him to death. I really do. But talking to him about why I'm not comfortable with him using rape jokes, for example, is very, very different than someone who uses it very ignorantly and very just. So when I give advice on interventions, like, all I can say is make sure that you're being educated about it and you're giving them information while you're doing it. But I feel that's kind of like a, yeah, that should come with the package. I mean, when it comes to personal family and friends, like, you know them best and you know how they respond to certain cues best. Just make sure it's presented in a way to them that they understand it and that they're going to consider it the most.
Another thing is that sometimes people will react to things. So if you criticize them, they're going to react.
Yes.
And they're not going to hear what you say.
Okay.
But you give them some time. You tell them, you give them the information, you give it more than once, maybe 3 or 4 times. Sometime down the road, when they've kind of calmed down and they step back from it, they're going to start.
Yes, try not to be accusatory about it. Like, I know some friends who are also into some social justice groups that use the phrase "check your privilege" a lot, and I personally just have avoided using that. Not because the person is not privileged and they're not being a jerk, but just because as soon as they hear that phrase, they no longer listen. And it sucks that they don't listen, and I understand why you want them to listen, but it's better for the dialogue if you talk about, and not only, but it goes back to individuals and institutions. At that moment, you're taking the institutional discussion of what privilege is, and you're making it individual by blaming them about not, understanding their privilege. And that's not the point. The point is to get them thinking about how it's institutionalized and how they are kind of not being aware about how they're using it at that moment. And when you take it in an institutional level, okay, that's my big advice then for that question. Institutionalization. Buzzword, but it really though. It's useful to talk about anything when it comes to different levels of oppression with sexism and racism and all these different things, is that it really comes back to how institutionalization changes everything. And I've found that that's my most useful tool when talking to people about how these things affect me, is we bring it back to whatever big thing you're talking about, like how, rape affects everybody, or, all these different things, or how, it ends up, it gives them the bigger perspective. And then, so let's talk about this one thing you're doing and how this big thing relates to that, and why doing this one thing not as much might help, make this a little easier for people who have gone through this.
Another thing with men at that sort of level, is that if you talk about, well, what about, is this how you want your mom or your sister or your child or whatever?
Yes and no. I understand that argument, and I've heard it before, but I also feel like, what point are we coming to where they have to visualize like someone close to them to hear that? Like, why can't they just hear a human woman is going through this? You know, I understand that, because it works for some people, and I if that's what you have to do, you have to do. But I really would just like to be at a point where, look, a human person is going through this crap. Can we just humanize with that for a second?
I had an idea where we could take the sexism part out of the equation and just turn it into a variety thing. I usually play as a male avatar given the choice because it's not something that I am. That's something different. I play games to escape. So what we could do is package it as, well, that armor's rather skimpy and not terribly effective. You've got all the internal organs from here to here exposed. How about if you make it more effective? Or if you can take, say, well, she wouldn't actually be able to pull that bow back with the size J.
Right. I mean,
turn it into something, because people flinch when you say things like sexism and rape jokes and all that stuff. People mentally go, oh God, because that hurts. It's a natural response. But if we could turn it into something a bit more practical, a bit more empirical thing.
I'm not quite understanding you saying that we shouldn't use the word sexism and rape.
No, it's more like just when you're talking about just strictly game design thing, instead of saying, oh, that design is sexist, you could say that design is not terribly practical.
I mean, so
sort of gently edge people into being more fair to the female sex that way, instead of immediately getting in their face with a huge problem.
So I understand the point you're trying to make. However, there's a few things with this. So I feel like when we have a coded, essentially what we're doing, what you're suggesting is a coded language. So rather than addressing the issue up front by saying this design is,
not instead of, I mean, we should have the talks where it's about the sexism. And
right. I understand. But so my issue is just that if I saw, so for example, if I saw like if I was working on a game and I saw the sexualized design on there, with like the bikini, if I saw like if I was with a bikini-clad woman and like a full suit armor man, I feel like I have every right to call that out as sexist because the man has full armor and the woman doesn't. And I feel like if we speak in a coded language about the subject, all we're going to be doing is it's going to not cause, like, we need to have a progressive dialogue right now. And I understand what you're saying as it makes people flinch, but the reason why people are flinching is because we've been limiting the dialogue for so long because people are afraid to talk about it. Like I said, people are afraid to talk about it because they're afraid of losing their jobs. And now we're at a point where people are finally like, no, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to talk about this because this stuff is stupid. And people are able to keep their jobs now because they're able to talk about it at the same time. And it's great. And so the thing is that, there are people who have, fought really hard to get to a point where they can talk about, a design being the word sexist and also still being able to keep the job at the same time, because that in itself is a sign that we've made progress in the dialogue. And I see why the word can cause people to flinch, but at the same time, I think that as we talk about it more, we flinch less, and it's not a matter of, and we have to think about why the word makes us flinch. Why does the word sexism have to make us flinch? If we just, there's this really great talk by Jay Smooth on TED about talking about racism, moving the race discussion forward, where he's like, I wish we could get to a point one day where we can talk about, privilege and things as just, you have a little bit of racism stuck in your teeth and not be like, whoa, man, like, which is a really good way to think about it, because when we talk about this, we're not trying to call the person who made that design a sexist bigot. We're just trying to point out, like, look, the choice you made here was just, female players are not going to be happy about that because they're not, and not to say that all female players, but just the ones who choose those avatars, female players who play female players, are not going to be happy with that design decision. And we have the right to have that discussion open and not use this, undercurrent language anymore. You know, does that make any sense?
Yeah, and then there's also the problem with the other thing though, is the thing where if a guy is accused of rape, even if it's completely untrue, complete bollocks, nobody could possibly believe it, his reputation is destroyed forever. And the diluted version of that happens when somebody says, that design's rather sexist, that guy's going to be a sexist the rest of his life. He's going to be a career of sexism there.
I mean, there are studies that speak otherwise, so I don't know how I feel about that particularly, but...
It's just a social thing.
Okay, if you want to continue the dialogue, you can find me another time, but I think there's other hands. Yeah?
One issue with well, not issue, but one response to the knowing that character more sexy is, well, we've got plenty of sexy characters. Let's try some unsexy characters so they have some choice. In a lot of games, there's the hulking, full-suited armor guy, but there's also the guy that's wearing no shirt and pants and it's really fast. So there is some variety there. So couldn't that tack also be made, but not no sexy, just some sexy, some not sexy as well.
To go back to the impractical argument, the response to that is a different response than being called out on sexist. If I'm in a design room and somebody says, that's not practical, my counter might be, but it looks cool. And that can apply to a lot of things, like the Deus Ex Human Revolution, the guy who's got sunglasses built onto his face. Completely impractical, but it looks cool. And if I'm arguing with somebody on that level, that's a different argument than if somebody points out, this character you've designed looks sexist. And then I'm going to stop and go, oh, wait a minute. Does it? Uh-oh. And I just think that's why it's necessary to call a spade, for lack of a better term.
Yes, calling your moderator. One of the reasons why I brought Jennifer here, and one of the things that I have a theory about, I have a background in social sciences, is that addressing sexism in the game industry is kind of also a way of moving forward and addressing all forms of sort of exclusionary tactics in the game industry related to race and ethnicity and
sexual orientation, physical disability. It can go on for a while.
For instance, that like one of the best sort of things you can do if you want to make a country more democratic is to just educate women, and then all sort of forms of bigotry that holds down the society can go away. And so I'm kind of hearing the conversation just circle around this endless loop of, well, is this sexist? Is this sexist? Are we using the right words here? And I feel like that's kind of narrowing it down immensely from what we could be talking about in a more robust way. So I'm just kind of encouraging everyone in this room to kind of think a little bit bigger about how addressing sexism is a way forward in the game industry to make it better for everyone, women, and people of different skin colors, different sexual orientations, and kind of a little bigger than we are right now.
Yes.
Ideally, would you like to see all games be inclusive and not sexist, or the landscape? Or the landscape of games be more diverse and have each one different and catered towards it?
So let me say this loud and clear, because I know this is going online at some point, and I don't want any Gamergate conspiracy theorists to think otherwise. I'm not arguing for some matriarchal movement where every game is a copy of Captain Planet, and we have like a multi-ethnic game with gender equality, because that creates, because if everything has the exact same gender balance and the exact same everything, then we've created a bland atmosphere. What I do want to see is that the amount of games we release, if we release 600 games a year, I want, roughly 300 games to have, a female protagonist. I want roughly 300 games to have like an ethnic protagonist or something. I want the games we produce, they don't have to all be the same thing. That's boring, man. But I'd love to see just I want to see games that are different. I'm happy to play another game with a male protagonist. Because guess what? I'm going to be doing that for a long time. And guess what? A lot of the games with problematic content in them, I play and are fun. God, when I was 14, my sister and I were playing God of War, and there's a lot of problems with God of War that I have. But you know, you kill stuff, and it's fun. So, you know, I mean, so there's a balance you have to strike where you can enjoy something, but you also have to criticize it when there's problems because you know that somebody else has a right to play that and then be like, that really upset me. I am really offended by that, and I never want to play that again. And they're not wrong to feel that way. And so, when I think of what I want to see in games the next like 5, 10 years or whatever the time span is, I just want to see, when I look at the gaming sphere, I want to see like everything. Just, it doesn't have to all be in the same game, but I want to see like, you know, the E3 trailer lineup, and this last year it was like, white guy, white guy, white guy, white guy, white guy, white guy, and you know, that's not what we want. You know, we want to, because you know, what stories are we rehashing over and over again? I can tell the 30-year-old, scruffy, bearded, dead wife or girlfriend, and now he's sad and getting a revenge story over and over because I've seen it so many times. Right? Whoever said that? Yes.
White guy from the accounting department trying to save the world. Special forces hero.
Also, I just wanted to comment that the way those guys are dressed often, run the term heterosexual safety uniform.
I like you. Yeah.
So I know that you did that research on the industry and you're doing it on gameplay. Are you ever going to do it on game content?
There's already, so the reason why I haven't done game content yet is there's already so much out there on game content. You know, as a researcher, you look to see what hasn't yet been explored. And so when I was doing my first study, I was like, so much on game content, game culture, and then literally there's nothing on the industry. You know, other industries have studies on them that are already done, and I referenced some that were just like general workplace discrimination stuff, which is why I can't speak to one specific industry, but there's nothing on the game industry. So I was like, well, fine, I'll do it. And that's kind of how that happened. And so I'm doing one on gamer culture because there's some studies on gamer culture, but there's no specific study on, at least right now, I'm probably gonna say this, and then like, right before I launch mine, someone else is going to come up with theirs. I'll be like, well, never mind then. Academia, right? And so what's probably going to end up happening is I'm going to do mine on, you know, player opinions on diversity in gamer opinions on diversity in game content and how the industry is able to like predict that and work with that. And so that's fully quantitative. So it's going to be interesting for me because I'm still working with the data and kind of trying to pick apart and do different analysis on it. So that's kind of both industry and player. But there's so much on cultural on content already that I'm not sure if I'm going to go that direction.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about, I think in the past few years there's been a lot of movement on the front of game frameworks and like game development tools, thinking of like Twine and Unity, free tools that are a lot easier to get into than previously in the past decade or so. Do you think that is going to contribute positively within only the indie scene? Or do you think that's going to spread upward? Because I'm seeing, of course, a lot of movement like queer and female game developers in an indie sense, but the AAA scene still seems stagnant.
Right. So, you know, so it is a big question because the AAA market is also the one under the most pressure because they're given, you know, $300 million budgets, and for them, if they sell if they sell out like as much as they can, you know, these are games that sell, you know, $350 million in opening weekend, and they make a 3% profit margin. This is ridiculous. You know, the thing is that the AAA margins are at the point where they feel like they're under so much pressure that experimentation is something that they're afraid of. And in many cases for them, experimentation means you want us to try what now? A protagonist that looks different from all these other protagonists? But we're so afraid! And the sad part is if they tried something different, they might actually get more profit out of that. I don't have studies for that, but that's something you have to play with more. But you know, I have a feeling that players are at the point where they're craving diversity because there's always a saturation point that gets reached. I don't know how Twine and Unity are going to affect. I think what it's doing is it's creating more talent at a younger age. You know, I saw children at 6 years old like, hey, I found a bug in your game. I'm like, how do you know know this already. When I was 6, I was like, the game's not working. I thought it was my fault, and I stopped because I was frustrated. So what I think this is creating is it's creating more talented, kids at a younger age, who are more inclined to get into perhaps AAA, and I think they're going to perhaps, be the driving forces for some change. That's the best you're gonna get from me. I'm sorry. Did I see another hand at some point? Or no? Have we reached our saturation? Or no, we have a couple more. Okay, I can do this all day.
This is probably not as good or intelligent, but as much as I see sexy, female protagonist or female characters, I also see the over masculine, super muscular dudes.
Yeah.
And it's like, there's very little male protagonists that aren't, I'm Nathan Hale and I'm a Marine and I've got a giant gun and I'm manly. There's hardly a balance between that, and it's like I think there's also kind of a masculine sexism in a different spectrum. It's very positive to be this super muscular, beefy guy, and it's like, how can we also kind of trim the gender roles? I mean, not trim, but like you said about how women, there's not enough. I'd also like to see a game where the character's relatable.
You are so freaking right. Like, seriously. Dude, and there are some studies on that too, which I have a couple in the thing I'm working on, but just because I have not talked about it does not mean that is not a problem. I will say that with all forms of diversity in games. I know I didn't talk about sexual orientation. I barely touched on race a tiny bit, maybe. But and then I didn't even touch disability and all the others. But yes, masculinity is a huge issue in games. Like I said, I have problems with God of War. Because, I think there's a huge problem when we socialize our young boys to constantly see these giant, big, beefy, muscly guys as mans. Mans. Clearly, I'm a professional speaker. But when we see these people as what we see as men, and this is what a man is, it's incredibly toxic for young boys. And especially growing up with that, I can't speak to what that's done to men and self-esteem, because I haven't talked to men and self-esteem, and I haven't done that study yet. I think there are already studies on that you can look up. But, we especially also need diversity as well of male characters. Like I said, the 30-year-old muscly, scruffy white guy with the 5-o'clock shadow, he needs to just go away for a while. He can make a vintage comeback in 20 years. It's worked for Mario. Okay, someone else had a hand?
Yeah.
Yes.
I just wanted to add what I said to what you said. If you sorry.
No, I've done that all day, don't worry.
How AAA games on Twit always give us, and that if you didn't all whisk of us, you won't succeed because you can't get anywhere if you don't take whisks. And that's exactly what they need to get away from.
Yeah.
We got to y'all because Nintendo took a whisk and brought games back.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're 30 back to just being safe.
Yeah.
With more important issues of gender, ethnicity, and a lot of other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't break that, we're just going to be stagnant, and we're going to face a different issue. Instead of the game industry crashing, it's just going to be stagnant.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of ingenuity that the AAA industry can learn from indie, but I also think there's a lot of organization that indie could learn from AAA. If you guys could copy each other's homework sometime, we could all make better games. Okay.
I think a really good model for the AAA industry to look to would be U.S. film in the late 60s and 1970s. Guys like Francis Ford Coppola and Stanley Kubrick, who were taking risks in an industry that had grown comfortable. And I think if the AAA industry doesn't pick up that torch, maybe the indie game industry will have to do it ourselves.
Cool. All right, we're going over, but I'll give you guys 3 more questions, and then I'll say we're good. All right, 1, 2, 3. Okay, fine, 4. Fine, you haven't said one thing. I'll be nice to you. Okay, so yes, we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
I would that Olympian gets like a hero's welcome. Whatever adventure she has to take.
Of course. I picked that comment just because it's very poignant that we sexualize a lot of characters, and Olympian is not someone we think of as sexual. But I definitely agree that we could just deal with more normal characters. Back to his point earlier. All right, I think it was you had the next point?
Yeah, this is just more of a general comment about AAA games and the lack of risk. As a company, as soon as you get stocks and you are a giant traded company, you have an obligation to your shareholders. So you have to release content that will make money. That's why the repetition happens, because they know they can get reliable sales, which we see a lot in film these days. So the film reference from the 60s was quite accurate. But they can take risks that are relative to their budget, so they create smaller studios within a larger company framework to release things that are larger than indies but smaller than AAAs. So the repetition is there actually by requirement of size. We see that more than anywhere, especially that's how all the companies, especially in the US, function.
Is that a problem with the US economy then?
Yeah.
It's a function.
All right, guys, break the economy, we'll fix sexism. That's the moral.
But it's not specifically related to our country. It's specifically related to the function of that system. It's a flaw in the system design to say that once you grow large enough and your profit margins, even at 3%, are huge enough to support tons of people that you have a responsibility to. That's the issue with that function in that system.
Yes. Okay. Last? Okay, no, you and then your last one. Okay.
So, what developers excite you the most in the industry?
What developers? Okay, are you talking about developers or publishers? Because Simon Strange was in the room and he will kill me if I said a developer was a publisher. So developers are us, we're people. Publishers are like the big guys. This summer I got addicted to Don't Starve, and I die every 4 hours, and I love it every time. I love playing Willow. She's my favorite because you get to burn everything. No. I would say it's a really big mix right now, because right now I'm in the middle of diversifying what I play, because I'm normally an RPG person at heart. So I grew up on old JRPGs, like Final Fantasy IX is like still to this day. It's better than 7, and if you're wrong, you're wrong. Yeah, okay, that's what got me applause. Cool. If you're wrong, you're wrong. Wow, I'm an academic. But, and so going into modern RPGs, I got a lot of influence from like Mass Effect and others like that. I'm trying to diversify into other stuff right now. I'm getting into Remember Me right now. Yeah. I know, I haven't finished it yet, don't spoil. But like I'm trying to branch into more indies right now just to like get a feel for other genres, because I think playing things that you're not used to playing is important if you're getting into design. So like I started Thomas Was Alone, I haven't finished it, and I have like a bunch of other like really tiny other things I need to finish. But I like games. That is the moral. I play League, which is also really random because it's not like story-based at all, but support and mid are my favorite. You know, I think it's really important to, I guess for developers, I don't have a specific person that I like I have specific people who are developers that inspire me, but like I haven't talked with them specifically about like what they've done mechanically. So I guess I would go with like publishers right now. I guess the people who do Don't Starve are fantastic. That's my plug for them. Play Don't Starve. It's fun. It's fun. All right, go ahead.
My question was about Kickstarter. I was wondering if there was a study done, or if you had some like responses from people who had tried putting games on Kickstarter that were gender or some sort of diversity, their success rates versus.
No idea. I have no idea.
That is a great topic to study about.
Someone else can do it. I am so busy.
Well, I was suggesting that that's something that you could study.
All right. If you want to talk to me for a bit, I will just sit in this stool in the corner, and I will.
What rank in League?
I'm not ranked yet. I'm still kind of new to it, and I'm grinding, so I'm getting there. But yeah, woo! What?